Freedom is never voluntarily given by the oppressor. It must be demanded by the oppressed. Martin Luther King Jr. spoke those words over 60 years ago, but today, on African soil, they echo louder than ever. Imagine this, a continent of over 1 billion people, long trapped on digital toll roads built in Silicon Valley, suddenly flips the script. No more rerouted signals across oceans. No more silent costs draining billions. No more filtered narratives dictated by distant corporations. From beneath the red earth of Burkina Faso, a revolution rises not of weapons or protests, but of wires, data centers, and sheer belief. And at its center stands a young man named Ibrahim Traoré, who dares to ask, why should our data, our voices, our futures be controlled by those who never walked our streets or spoke our tongues? This is not a story about faster internet. It's a story about dignity, defiance, and destiny. It's about African sovereignty not in word but in infrastructure. Stay with us not for the headlines but for the heartbeat of a continent rising. Subscribe and stand for the digital freedom our ancestors never dreamed possible. Long before the headlines, before the speeches, before the cables stretched across sand and soil, there was a quiet injustice humming beneath Africa's surface. Every time a child in Ghana sent an email, every time a merchant in Kenya made a mobile payment, the signal did not travel directly. It bounced through data centers in Europe or the United States, looping thousands of miles before returning home. It was as if every letter to your neighbor had to be mailed via London or San Francisco. This wasn't merely inefficient, it was punishing. Internet in Africa ranked among the most expensive in the world, not because demand was low, but because the infrastructure belonged elsewhere. While Silicon Valley giants grew rich, African families paid dearly to keep their children online. In Burkina Faso, a rural household might spend a week's earnings just to keep schoolwork flowing. Behind the cost lay something deeper: control. Western tech conglomerates didn't just offer platforms, they determined the gatekeeping. What was seen, what was searched, what was promoted or buried, all passed through filters not designed for African truth. Algorithms prioritized Napoleon over the Mali Empire, foreign news over local voices. Knowledge itself was colonized. Then came Ibrahim Traoré. At just 30-something, the new leader of Burkina Faso wasn't merely seeking better broadband. He was demanding sovereignty not just over gold, not just over land, but over the very flow of African knowledge. To him, and to millions of young Africans, digital dependency was just another form of the old order, the extraction of value, the suppression of voice, the outsourcing of power. So he drew a line in the digital sand. His vision was bold, a continental internet exchange that would reroute Africa's data within Africa, break the monopoly, and reclaim the narrative. No more toll gates guarded by Google. No more search results that erased African history. No more payments that lined foreign pockets. The plan required more than passion. It demanded infrastructure. Over 100,000 kilometers of fiber optic cable connecting capitals and coasts. It called for 47 data hubs, strategically built across the continent, from the dry winds of Niamey to the shores of Dar es Salaam. And most daring of all, it introduced a protocol deliberately incompatible with Silicon Valley systems, a refusal to let Africa's renaissance be crawled, indexed, or monetized by outsiders. Many called it madness. Western analysts scoffed. African elites whispered doubts. Too ambitious, they said. Too expensive, others added. But beneath the hesitation, a spark began to catch. Engineers, students, policymakers, all weary of watching their talent exported and their stories erased, began to rally. They laid cable through jungles, they dug trenches through deserts. From Nairobi to Accra, a quiet army of builders emerged. And then the switch flipped. No grand ceremony, no global announcement, just a quiet, coded activation. But what happened next sent shockwaves around the world. Within 3 days, more than 200 million Africans migrated to the new system. No social network, no streaming platform, no global product, not even Facebook or TikTok had ever seen adoption on such a scale, so swiftly. The world blinked. Silicon Valley panicked. Google executives summoned emergency strategy calls. Microsoft's team scrambled to decode what went wrong. But the answer was simple and terrifying to them. The system wasn't failing, it was locked out by design. The African protocol, built with independence in mind, could not be indexed by Google's search spiders. Microsoft's cloud services bounced off it like oil on water. The old empire had no backdoor in. For Traoré and his allies, this was not just a technical achievement, it was a philosophical one. Power no longer flowed outward, influence no longer arrived pre-packaged from Seattle or Dublin. For the first time, Africa's digital roads led home. And yet, but building is only half the battle. The storm was still coming. The numbers alone were enough to cause a global stir: 200 million users in under 72 hours. But the impact was not just numerical. It was emotional, geopolitical, and ideological. In Silicon Valley, panic replaced confidence. Executives who had long viewed Africa as a developing market suddenly found themselves on the defensive. Google's crawlers failed to read the new African web. Microsoft's cloud couldn't access the network. The protocol that Ibrahim Traoré had championed was not a patch. It was a wall built, not to divide, but to reclaim. Emergency meetings filled boardrooms from San Francisco to Seattle. PR teams drafted statements. Lobbyists flooded Washington. But for all their power, the titans of tech were grasping at shadows. They couldn't shut it down. They hadn't built it, and they no longer had the keys. Meanwhile, in Europe, headlines sounded alarms. Africa breaks free from digital dependence. Internet fragmentation or digital liberation. Policymakers in Paris and Brussels, long accustomed to shaping Africa's digital narrative through cultural outreach and economic aid, now feared something more: profound irrelevance. In Washington, the reaction was quieter, but more calculating. Could this be considered a security threat? Was there justification for economic pressure? The debate grew heated behind closed doors. Words like sanctions and destabilization appeared in memos, but out in the open, officials hesitated. They knew the optics of punishing Africa for seeking independence were explosive, and all the while on the streets of Ouagadougou, Nairobi, Dakar, and Lagos, people were simply living a new reality. Students streamed lectures without buffering. Farmers used mobile apps built in their own countries, priced in local currencies, updated in their native languages. Business owners saw payment systems that didn't funnel money through Frankfurt or New York. Across social media, hashtags like #Africa Connected, Sovereignty Now, #Trovision began trending not just in English and French but in Swahili, Yoruba, and Fula. Young Africans shared short videos showing side-by-side comparisons of the old route versus the new route, data packets once circling the globe now taking a few milliseconds across the continent. The tone was not arrogant, it was liberated. But the celebration masked an undercurrent of tension. Within Africa, not everyone cheered. Several governments, those historically aligned with Western powers, grew uneasy. Would this digital autonomy empower civil society groups they had long tried to suppress? Would independent networks embolden political opposition? Could sovereignty become a double-edged sword? Civil society raised its own concerns. Freedom from Silicon Valley, yes, but what about freedom from surveillance at home? If African states now controlled the pipes, could they be trusted not to censor dissent? The very success of the movement raised new stakes. For Ibrahim Traoré, the moment was bittersweet. He stood before a continent in awe, knowing that what they had built was fragile. He gave a televised address not with triumph, but with clarity. This is not victory over the West. It is victory over silence. But if we silence each other next, then we've gained nothing. His message cut through the noise. It was not about revenge or pride, it was about responsibility. The digital tools now belong to Africa, but so did the burden of keeping them fair, open, and dignified. Outside Africa, analysts began asking a different question, not how did this happen, but what happens next? Would tech firms retaliate with closed services? Would Western nations find ways to force interoperability? Would the infrastructure buckle under scale? The answers were unclear, but one thing was certain: the monopoly was broken. And not by legislation, litigation, or lobbying, but by willpower. The story had reached its emotional peak, not because the danger had passed, but because Africa had chosen the harder path and had taken the first step. What happens when the monopoly cracks but the pressure multiplies? The revolution wasn't televised. It was downloaded, uploaded, and live-streamed in real time on a network Africa built for itself. In Burkina Faso, where Ibrahim Traoré first declared the vision. Families who once rationed their internet time now saw their children complete homework without interruption. Clinics in remote provinces accessed centralized patient data without routing through foreign servers. The change wasn't theoretical, it was immediate, personal, and profound. A woman in Lagos reported saving nearly 40% on her monthly data costs. In Nairobi, a university professor discovered that African history long buried beneath European interpretations in online searches now appeared first. His students could finally access digitized oral histories, regional scholarship, and archives that spoke in their own voices. For the first time in decades, African knowledge was not filtered. It flowed directly, freely, and authentically. In the markets of Ouagadougou, farmers used mobile apps coded locally, priced in local currencies, without foreign gatekeeping fees. This wasn't about rejecting the world, it was about reconnecting within. And the economic consequences were just as striking. The $50 billion that once left Africa each year to pay for digital services abroad began to stay, not in offshore accounts or stock exchanges, but in local businesses, salaries, and innovation hubs. Engineers who once left for Europe now received offers at home. Startups that had no chance against foreign giants suddenly found space to grow. A young coder in Accra, once forced to optimize her app for Silicon Valley APIs, now built natively for African protocols. Her download numbers exploded not globally but across her own region. She didn't need to go viral in America. She had an audience right outside her window. These shifts reached far beyond convenience. They reshaped identity. Across classrooms, boardrooms, farms, and living rooms, Africans began to ask not with defiance, but with clarity. Why did we ever accept less? And yet, the deeper question lingered. Could it last? Civil society leaders stepped forward. This wasn't a victory lap, it was a moment of vigilance. Do not mistake independence for immunity, one activist warned. Sovereignty can be used to liberate or to control. Already, debates flared around who governed the new networks. Would governments ensure freedom of expression? Or would they adopt the censorship tools of the very empires they had just escaped? The challenge shifted from fighting monopolies to building democratic resilience. Still, the overall mood was hopeful. Across posters, murals, and music, a new phrase emerged. Our data, our destiny. It wasn't anti-Western. It was pro-African. It rejected pity and demanded parity. In religious gatherings, imams and pastors alike spoke of the internet revolution as a form of divine restoration, a spiritual metaphor for reclaiming voice, memory, and purpose. The shift wasn't just political or economic, it was cultural, and for many, it felt redemptive. If before, Africa exported everything gold, cocoa, oil, even its stories now, for the first time in generations, it kept something precious. Its data, its narrative, its future. So the question echoed beyond cables and code. If you believe it's time for Africa to write its own script, say it proudly in the comments below. This wasn't a slogan. It was an invitation. Yet freedom, once gained, must still be defended, especially from within. From afar, the world watched with a mix of fascination, confusion, and quiet dread. In Washington, think tanks scrambled to recalibrate. The usual vocabulary, digital aid, capacity building, cyber partnerships, sounded suddenly hollow. Behind closed doors, officials admitted what was once unthinkable. Africa was no longer just consuming tech, it was designing it. The United States, long a self-declared guardian of free internet, faced an uncomfortable question. If Africa's decision to build its own digital highways mirrored American ideals of self-reliance and sovereignty, why did it feel like a threat? That contradiction stirred unease. Publicly, American diplomats stressed dialogue and partnership. Privately, tech executives lobbied for protections, warning that regional fragmentation could hurt global commerce. Yet beneath those arguments lay a deeper fear, the loss of control. In Paris and London, the mood was no less tense. These capitals had once shaped African education, media, and infrastructure. But now, search engines in Nairobi no longer prioritized French content. Algorithms no longer defaulted to colonial languages. For nations that prided themselves on cultural diplomacy, the shift felt existential. While some dismissed the movement as temporary, others sounded alarms. What Africa has done in months, we failed to do in decades. And outside the Western sphere, a ripple became a wave. In South America, governments studied Africa's model. Brazil, Argentina, and Colombia began exploratory talks on continental infrastructure, citing digital sovereignty not as a luxury but a survival strategy. In Asia, countries already experimenting with regional cloud systems now had proof total independence was possible not only technically but politically. Even within the Middle East, nations long dependent on foreign platforms began auditing their vulnerabilities. What if our cables are cut? What if our narratives are filtered? Africa had opened a door that others had only dreamed of unlocking. Yet not every government saw inspiration. In Beijing, the success was noted, but with caution. China's own Great Firewall was built on exclusion. Africa's model was not about cutting off the world, it was about reconnecting on its own terms. That distinction mattered. And in Russia, analysts saw opportunity. As sanctions had pushed them toward self-reliance, Africa's rebellion validated their suspicions. The age of one internet, ruled by one system, was over. The world had not only witnessed a technical pivot, it had watched the beginning of a geopolitical realignment. And at the heart of it stood Ibrahim Traoré, not with missiles or tanks, but with cables, protocols, and vision. But was this a regional shift, or the birth of a global reckoning? Africa had taken the leap, but now it faced the landing. The cables had been laid. The data flowed locally. The headlines had shifted from doubt to astonishment. But what next? For Ibrahim Traoré, the answer was never just about infrastructure. It was about discipline, unity, and clarity of purpose. He warned his people, sovereignty is not a ceremony, it is a responsibility. We've broken the chain, but we must not build a new one for ourselves. That message echoed across the continent, from Addis Ababa to Windhoek. Governments convened to discuss standards not just technical but ethical. How would this new internet protect dissent? How would it balance security with freedom? Could African sovereignty survive both foreign sabotage and domestic temptation? These were not theoretical concerns. In some states, old habits resurfaced, calls for tighter control under the banner of national stability. Civil society groups pushed back, reminding leaders that this revolution was born from openness, not obedience. At the same time, young Africans, students, coders, journalists began demanding more than just access. They wanted governance, transparency, rights. Murals appeared in cities from Nairobi to Ouagadougou, not just celebrating victory, but asking new questions. Who owns our platforms now? Whose voice sets the terms? Can freedom in fiber survive fear in politics? And yet, for every doubt, there was a visible gain. A student watching lectures, uninterrupted in Kiswahili. A farmer receiving fair pricing via peer-to-peer tools. A doctor diagnosing remotely in local dialects. A startup going regional without passing through foreign clouds. These were not hypotheticals. They were lived experiences, proof that the path, however uncertain, was walkable. Still, the road ahead would not be smooth. Foreign lobbying intensified. Offers of partnership returned, this time rebranded as interoperability, open frameworks, and global inclusion. The language was familiar, the intention unchanged. Inside Africa, the biggest threat was fatigue. Could the momentum last once the cameras moved on? Would nations invest in maintaining, upgrading, defending their systems when the novelty faded? That, perhaps, was the ultimate test. Because the choice was no longer between dependence and defiance, it was between discipline and drift, between sustaining the spark or letting it flicker. And as the continent stood at this crossroads, one question pulsed beneath it all. And now the world watches not just what Africa built, but whether it will last. The story of Africa's internet revolution is not just about cables, servers, or software. It is about something older and deeper, the human right to define one's own path. In a world where power often hides in code and control slips quietly through cloud contracts, Ibrahim Traoré reminded us that sovereignty is not a relic of the past. It is today's unfinished business. And for millions across the continent, it has become not only a political claim, but a lived digital reality. For older generations in the United States, those who remember marching for voting rights, watching the Berlin Wall fall, or waiting for their children to return from distant wars, this African moment might feel familiar. Different imagery, yes, but the same heartbeat. A people refusing to be passengers on someone else's system. African sovereignty in the digital age is not about isolation. It is about balance, ensuring that the tools meant to connect us do not quietly divide or diminish us. And in building their own infrastructure, Africans have reminded the world that freedom must also include the right to build, to protect, and to decide. As we stand here, witnessing the reversal of centuries of extraction not only of gold, labor, and oil, but now of knowledge, we are also witnessing the planting of new roots. Fiber optic roots, ethical roots, continental roots. And so, the question is no longer just, what did Africa do? It is, what will you do when your turn comes? Will you accept safety and dependence or risk freedom? Because make no mistake, this is not just their story. It is ours too. If this story reignites something forgotten in you, don't scroll past it. Like it, share it, speak it. Subscribe, because the fiber of freedom begins with every witness who chooses to remember. And tell us in the comments, what does freedom look like in your language, in your family, in your lifetime? Say it with pride. Africa knew. Digital freedom is real freedom. Ibrahim Traoré speaks for us all. Africa, you've shown us the way. Because when Ibrahim Traoré stood before his people and said, "Dependence ends the day we decide it ends," he wasn't just speaking to Africa. He was speaking to everyone still waiting for the power to choose.